Welcome back. Last time we took a look at the beginning of horror games in and outside Japan, and we found that some of the earliest horror games from Japan were a certain AX2 Uchuyu Sousen no Sutoromo from 1981, or 1982 as some sources say, released by ASCII Publishing, as well as some graphic text adventures released by the Nihon Falcom Corporation, such as Horror House and Kyoki no Yakata. Both were from 1983 and might have been inspired by the earlier American graphical text adventure Mystery House from 1980, as well as Demon's Ringu and Ijigen Kara no Dashutsu, both from 1984. Those were still comparatively simple games though, but over time video games became more complex, a development that could also be witnessed within the evolution of Japanese horror games. And so, in this video, I would like to present two milestones of Japanese horror games that also serve as good examples of this development. I will be introducing one important and very influential title from 1989 and another noteworthy title from 1995, both of which will demonstrate how Japanese horror game developers began to explore increasingly cinematic and narrative-filled presentations. Of course, that's not to say that older horror games were devoid of narratives or cinematic qualities. I mean, games like Ijigen Kara no Dashutsu, for instance, were pretty much nothing but a narrative that was controlled through text inputs and accompanied by very simple, but nonetheless cinematic still images. However, the continuous advances in technology kept giving developers of horror games better graphics, more cartridge or hard drive space, more power, and therefore new ways to explore the cinematic and narrative possibilities of video games. New ways to create interactive horror fiction of larger scale and ambition than the short and straightforward games that came before. So, let's begin. 4, 2, 1. Sweet Home. The first title I want to talk about is a horror RPG called Sweet Home, released in 1989 by Capcom for Nintendo's Famicom video game console, which is also known as the Nintendo Entertainment System or NES in many countries. Sweet Home was a title of profound importance insofar as that several years later, some of its elements would become the foundation for one of the most important survival horror franchises, namely none other than Biohazard, also known as Resident Evil. So what exactly is Sweet Home and how did it influence Resident Evil? Well, first let's talk about how the game came to be. For that, I would like you to think back to chapter 3.8, in which I talked about the director Kurosawa Kiyoshi. Therein I briefly mentioned that Kurosawa Kiyoshi had his first major debut when he wrote and directed the horror movie Sweet Home, which got released in 1989. I also explained that this title would be relevant again once we talk about Japanese video games, and here we are, because as you probably guessed by now, the game Sweet Home was based on that movie. As stated in chapter 3.8, the movie Sweet Home was produced by Itami Juzo and directed by Kurosawa Kiyoshi. It was published in January 1989. The plot of the movie Sweet Home deals with a small film crew consisting of 5 people who visit the abandoned mansion of a certain Ichiro Mamiya. This Mamiya was an artist, and it is believed that some of his famous frescoes can still be found within his mansion. The film crew intends to find and restore these paintings and also film a documentary about Mamiya there. Once inside, however, supernatural events unfold revolving around the onryo of Mamiya's deceased wife and her dead son. Now, the video game Sweet Home also credits Itami Juzo as producer, mentions Kurosawa Kiyoshi as supervisor, and gives special thanks to someone named Arthur King, which is actually just one of the pen names of a certain Fujiwara Tokuro, whom other sources cite as the director of the game. It was released in December 1989. To learn more about how this game came to be, let us focus on Fujiwara Tokuro for a moment. Up until then, Fujiwara Tokuro had only been working on arcade games by Capcom, such as Makaimura, known as Ghosts and Goblins in English, or Senjo no Okami, known as Commando in English. A quick note, the screenshots on the right are not from the arcade, but from the NES versions. But then, Fujiwara Tokuro decided to create his first game for home consoles, and started coming up with all kinds of ideas. And eventually, it was decided to use these ideas for a video game adaptation of the movie Sweet Home. Kurosawa Kiyoshi, director of the original movie, gave Fujiwara permission to deviate from the source material where needed, but it should be noted that Fujiwara actually took the time to learn about the film and even toured the movie set, so as to grasp the movie's essence and aptly combine it with the game elements that he had already in mind. Many of the game's final items and environments were also created based on this, while elements that had already been considered but did not fit into the world of the movie were cut from the game. In the end, the main part where the game did deviate from the film consisted less of story alterations, but rather of story additions. Through the use of diary entries that can be found and collected within the game's abandoned mansion, Fujiwara expanded on some plot points that were only hinted at within the movie. This is of particular importance, for here we have a game developer not just working closely with a film studio to create a horror game of similar narrative and cinematic quality for its time, but even expanding on the plot in a meaningful way. To emphasize how significant this was, I would like to quote directly from an article that deals with Sweet Home, called Place of Residing Evil, looking back at Capcom's original survival horror, written by Ben Reeves in 2018. He explains, quote, "It was unprecedented in the late 80s for a video game to expand on a film's narrative in this way. Most games of the era were lucky if they could accurately communicate the main beats of the film they were adapting, let alone embellish the narrative. Fujiwara, on the other hand, knew games were capable of doing more than was expected of them, and this push to explore the limits of the gaming medium can be seen in every element of Sweet Home's design." Quote end. As for Sweet Home's cinematic qualities, nowadays we're used to a whole different level of film-like presentation in games, so at a first glance, it might be hard to imagine anything all too cinematic in this game, but it certainly has some film-like moments. Here is an example. For another example, note how the transition from exploring the mansion to fighting an enemy is handled. Ominous music sets in, transitions to darkness with the music getting more and more tense, and suddenly whatever monster attacks you is presented very abruptly, accompanied by a loud sound effect. As simplistic as this may seem to some people today, it was probably quite a unique battle transition for its time, and could well have been inspired by the way some horror movies handle tense scenes that end with a jump scare. Okay, next, I would like to highlight some parts of Sweet Home that would go on to influence the Resident Evil franchise. First, let us talk once more about the diary entries that can be found and collected within the abandoned mansion, because that is certainly something Resident Evil made use of as well. From the original Resident Evil 1 up to the latest entry, which at the time that I am recording this would be Resident Evil 8, also known as Resident Evil Village, the Resident Evil games have never stopped using documents, such as diary entries and others, scattered throughout the game to expand on the story that the player is experiencing. But that is not all. There is a lot more that was already part of Sweet Home before it would be picked up again for Resident Evil. Just take a look at this. The famous door opening sequences that occur between rooms in some of the first Resident Evil games were actually already part of Sweet Home. Furthermore, Sweet Home tells the story of a group of people entering a deserted mansion in the woods where they get trapped inside and need to find a way to escape. Sweet Home has more than one ending depending on how many people you save. Sweet Home makes use of important items that open up new areas. Sweet Home has limited inventory space. Also, the amount of overall healing items in Sweet Home was limited. There are unique character-bound items in Sweet Home, such as for instance a lighter. Sweet Home ends with the mansion getting destroyed. Is this beginning to sound familiar? It should if you have ever played Resident Evil 1, because these are all ideas that the first Resident Evil game would pick up again one way or another. Resident Evil 1 also has a group of people trapped in an isolated mansion. Different endings depending on who survives. Key items that are necessary to progress the game. Limited inventory space. Limited items, and this time not just limited healing, but also limited bullets and more. One of Resident Evil 1's protagonists, called Jill, gets a lockpick that only she can use. The sequel, Resident Evil 2, had unique items for both characters, by the way, including a lighter. And the mansion gets destroyed in most endings. I will elaborate some more on the connection between Sweet Home and Resident Evil 1 once we reach Chapter 4.4, which is going to deal with the Resident Evil series, but for now I think I have proven my point. As a closing remark, I would like to add that Sweet Home is of course much more than simply the game that inspired Resident Evil 1 mixed with supernatural elements. It's an innovative and atmospheric horror RPG that can stand on its own feet as a title with plenty of uncanny and scary horror content. And among the many ways in which it actually creates fear in the player, I would like to highlight highlight the fact that each of your characters can die permanently, making enemy encounters a lot more tense than in any standard RPG. And with that, I will end the discussion of Sweet Home. Unfortunately, this title never got released outside Japan, but at least its legacy lives on in the tremendous international success of the Resident Evil franchise. 4.22 Clock Tower. Kurokutawa, or Clock Tower, is another good example of Japanese horror game developers using increasingly cinematic and narrative-filled presentations. This title was released in Japan in September 1995 for the Super Famicom, which is also known as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES in many countries. The publisher of Clock Tower was Human Entertainment, and it was directed by Kono Hifumi, whose work on Clock Tower was heavily inspired by the horror films of Italian director Dario Argento, especially Argento's work from the 1970s and 1980s. The most notable influence was Argento's film Phenomena from 1985. Even the protagonist of Clock Tower, Jennifer Simpson, was designed and named after the protagonist Jennifer Corvino from Phenomena. The plot once again brings us to an isolated mansion in the woods. Protagonist Jennifer Simpson and a few other girls, all orphans from the Granite Orphanage in Norway, are adopted by Mary Barrows from the wealthy Barrows family and are taken to their residence. There's also a huge clock tower which belongs to their estate and gives the game its title. Now let me show you how the game presents this info to us in its intro, and you will probably see why I chose Clock Tower as my next example. By the way, this video was originally created in 2023 when no official English version of Clock Tower existed, so for scenes that I wanted to show in English, I used footage from a fan translation. But in 2024, an enhanced port of the game was released called Clock Tower Rewind, which also features English texts. Check it out if you want to play the game yourself. But okay, here's the intro I wanted to show you. This entire intro, with its cinematic shots and realistic looking characters, especially for Super Nintendo standards, feels like something straight out of an actual movie. Even though it's basically just still images, I can immediately picture what this whole sequence would look like in a proper film. After this, Clock Tower switches to the graphics that are used throughout most parts of the game and shows us how Jennifer and the other orphans are told to wait in the mansion's main hall while Mary Barrows leaves. But even with those more game-like graphics, a certain filmic look remains due to the fact that Jennifer's movements are actually based on a real woman from Human's planning division that acted them out before they were turned into the graphics you see inside the game. Furthermore, some character graphics were also digitizations of pictures from real people. As time passes, Mary Barrows does not return, so Jennifer goes off to search for her. The player gets a brief moment of control here, only to be surprised by sudden screaming coming from the main hall. Jennifer runs back and everyone is gone. And this is where the player finally has full control over Jennifer's next moves. Now, what makes the horror in this game quite effective is not just the creepy mansion itself. There's also the fact that you are being stalked by the Scissor Man, a weird creature possibly inspired by the American slasher movie The Burning from 1981. I won't reveal more about his background in case you want to try this game out for yourself, but his recurring appearances and his relentless pursuit of Jennifer is made even worse by the fact that you have no real way of fighting back, except for a button prompt that sometimes allows you to push him to the ground if Jennifer still has enough stamina for that. The only only other options you have are usually running and hiding. Oh, and you don't even control Jennifer directly, because Clock Tower is actually a point-and-click game that makes use of a cursor with which you tell Jennifer where to go or what to examine. There's also a sort of health status based on the color and expressions of Jennifer's portrait that indicates how fatigued Jennifer is, and depending on her condition, she may start to make mistakes like tripping and falling. This passive control of Jennifer adds another layer of filmic quality to the game, since, as with many point-and-click games, it often feels like you're merely part of an interactive movie, giving its main actress vague directions and places to inspect and then watching what happens. And although the game can feel slow at times, not least due to the point-and-click mechanics, all of the above-mentioned elements can lead to some pretty intense moments. For example, when you're running away from the Scissor Man and suddenly maneuver Jennifer into a dead end, with only a limited amount of time to check if you can somehow still save her while the Scissor Man comes closer. Look at the following scene. Hunted by the Scissor Man, the player had directed Jennifer up a ladder, but this turned out to be a dead end. And although there is a way to save her in this situation, if the player doesn't know it, then they can only sit there and watch in horror, asking themselves whether or not the Scissor Man will follow Jennifer up the ladder, almost as if they were watching an actual horror film. Here's another example of such a scene. Again, it's not like these tense scenes will always end in Jennifer's death. In the example I just showed you, there's also a way to survive this, but when you're playing the game for the first time and don't know the right course of action, then sometimes you can only try something out and watch with horror movie-like suspense whether or not you made the right choice. Here's an example of a rather disturbing encounter, and this time I won't tell you how it ends, so you can experience the uncertainty for yourself. Phew, she made it, but of course Jennifer can also die here. These are moments where Clock Tower, through its unique control scheme that only gives you a sort of limited control over Jennifer, displays a clever mix of interactive video game and passive horror film experience. From time to time, Clock Tower also switches back to the more cinematic style that was used during the opening sequence, which adds yet again to its horror movie feeling. Here are a few examples. There were further Clock Tower games, even though Kono Hifumi had initially not been interested in creating any sequels to his original work on the Super Famicom, but while the second game still did comparatively well, the third and fourth entry both performed rather poorly. The fourth was actually praised a lot for its plot and presentation, but its gameplay wasn't well received. Thereafter, the series sadly vanished. The second game was still directed by Kono Hifumi, by the way. The third and fourth were in the hands of others. It's also worth noting that in 2016 a game called Night Cry was released that had been directed by Kono Hifumi again and could be considered Clock Tower's spiritual successor. Unfortunately, while I haven't played it myself, the critical reception wasn't very positive. Still, if you played the old Clock Tower games and want more of the same, then I suppose it might be worth a look. Be that as it may, the first Clock Tower is certainly a great example of a unique Japanese horror game with an uncanny setting, great atmosphere, a film-like presentation, and clever elements that blurred the line between video game and interactive movie. Fittingly enough, Clock Tower was actually the third entry in a series of games that Human Entertainment had labeled Cinematic aRdW, which could be translated as cinematic and live. The manual of Clock Tower calls this a genre and defines it as follows: Cinematic live, a new genre by Human Entertainment that combines the intensity of movies and the tension of a live performance. The latter probably referring to the fact that the movie-like experience is performed live by the player, so to speak, which makes the outcome far from predictable and adds tension, as the outcome of everything will depend on your live reactions to the game. The other two titles in this series were Septentrion from 1993 and The Fireman from 1994, by the way, but those weren't horror games. And with that, we have reached the end of this video, in which I showed you two milestones of Japanese horror games, which also served as examples of how Japanese horror games, just like many other game genres, began to try out increasingly cinematic presentations and complex narratives as technology advanced. And in the next video, we will take a look at a certain game series that was also released by Human Entertainment not long after Clock Tower. This series is called Twilight Syndrome. I hope to see you there, and as always, take care and goodbye.